After such an introduction, I should just leave the room immediately, but I promised the lecture, so I apologize for reading, but because we have a time limit, I want to be on time, so we want to stay here until the middle of the night, so I hope it will be fine. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Lurianic Kabbalah, and the title of my talk today will be Man's Personal Responsibility for God's Faith. And I want to begin far away from the 16th century. More than 70 years ago, in 1942, a young Dutch Jewess named Etty Hilsum, that maybe some of you have heard about her, living under Nazi occupation in Amsterdam and experiencing a religious, emotional and spiritual awakening, wrote the following in her diary. And I quote, "I shall try to help you, God, to stop my strength from ebbing away, though I cannot vouch for it in advance. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear to me, that you cannot help us, that we must help you to help ourselves. Alas, there does not seem to be much you yourself can do about our circumstances, about our lives. Neither do I hold you responsible. You cannot help us, but we must help you and defend your dwelling place in us to the last." Hilsum was sent to Auschwitz a year later, less than a year later, and was murdered there. And her diaries containing this and other original prayers, as well as loads of very interesting stuff. I really recommend that you read her amazing diaries. Forming the prayers, these original prayers, are forming one of the most profound, original and daring theological responses to the Holocaust. And they had to wait over 40 years before becoming known to the wide public. However, her prayer was echoed in the writings of one of the most original and interesting Jewish philosophers of the 20th century, Hans Jonas, and especially in his famous lecture about the concept of God after Auschwitz, first published in 1968. In an attempt to rethink the concept of God, acknowledging that it was God that, in brackets, let it happen, he asks the obvious question, what God could let it happen? And offers a seemingly very radical and unorthodox figure of a God, a deity who, and I quote, chose to give itself over to the chance and risk an endless variety of becoming. And wholly so, entering into the adventure of space and time, the deity held back nothing of itself. No uncommitted or unimpaired part remained to direct, correct, and ultimately guarantee the devious working out of its destiny in creation. So what is Jonas actually saying? Jonas is describing a God which is a suffering God. It is a God who is becoming, not just is, emerging in time instead of possessing a completed being that remains identical with itself throughout eternity. And it is also a caring God, not remote, and I quote here, not remote and detached and self-contained, but involved with what he cares for. Last, but perhaps most importantly, at least for us, it is not an omnipotent God. And so, returning to Auschwitz, it is a God who remains silent, and again I quote, not because he chose not to, but because he could not intervene did he fail to intervene. And here Jonas returns to the radical point made by Etty Hilsum. Having given himself whole to the becoming world, God has no more to give. It is man's now to give to him. Now, the relevancy of man's responsibility towards God to present-day concerns, both religious and at least seemingly secular, is thus becoming clearer. And perhaps even more so once we consider Jonas' great influence on the ecological movement. He's one of the most important thinkers of the ecological movement since the 60s, especially in Europe. But now the question should arise, what does this quite lengthy presentation of such unorthodox, daring views of God and of man's relation to it has to do with the title of this lecture, right? Which is Lurianic Kabbalah, to say nothing of the most important text in Jewish tradition, which is, I think, the general name of this series of talks. This is, to be sure, not a random choice, as Jonas' outrageous theological suggestion is actually deeply rooted in the kabbalistic tradition and follows, by the way, in full self-awareness, the doctrines of Lurianic Kabbalah. However, unlike the impression one may get from Jonas's description, Kabbalah in general and Lurianic Kabbalah in particular are quite far from being merely an undercurrent, as Jonas calls it, of Jewish thought tradition. But have been for more than 3/4 of a millennium a central cultural phenomenon in Judaism. Kabbalah has left a deep mark on almost every field of Jewish life, in ritual, liturgy, popular and elite beliefs, and is an active part of Jewish, but certainly not only Jewish, just think of Newton, for example, life. Even today, in the beginning of the 21st century, and for example, this is an example I always give, whenever you say Shabbat Shalom, whoever says that, uses a kabbalistic practice. Okay? Okay. Lurianic Kabbalah, that is the Kabbalah derived from the teachings of Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Holy Ari, right, Holy Lion, when the acronym is pronounced literally, whose name is synonymous with Safed's 16th century spiritual renaissance, is without a doubt the most famous and important creation of late Kabbalah, second only to the book of the Zohar in the history of Kabbalah as a whole. Not only is this one of the peaks of religious imagination, Lurianic Kabbalah serves as a key to the understanding of many of the Jewish religious currents ever since. And I'm talking here both with Sabbatianism and Hasidism, mentioned before, but also religious Zionism of the Re'aya Kook, and even now in current New Age Kabbalah, which most of it bases itself on different forms or different interpretations of Lurianic Kabbalah. Now, the idea of God being affected by human deeds, and moreover of God as a weak God, in need of human action to strengthen him or to restore his power, has important precedence in rabbinic thought. And in certain ways, perhaps even earlier. One might even think that biblical religion is very much based on this idea. However, it becomes very central in the Kabbalah and is brought us, so to speak, to perfection in the Lurianic myth about a God who breaks down to pieces and needs man, even creates man, in order to mend him and restore his power to give. Right? Remember the first descriptions of Jonas and Hilsum. Now, to this kabbalistic depiction of the cosmic history and present, and to its consequences to the self-understanding and self-consciousness of the kabbalists, I would like to devote what little time I have after this very lengthy introduction. So, before we can immerse ourselves in the Lurianic teachings, a few words about the historical phenomenon of the Kabbalah are needed. Kabbalah emerged as a distinct spiritual intellectual movement in the context of rabbinic Judaism's encounter with Neo-Aristotelianism and Neoplatonic philosophy in the Middle Ages. And in certain ways it can be seen as one of the responses to the great appeal of philosophy and to the challenges posed by it. A kind of a merge between ancient rabbinic traditions and the new ideas coming through Arabic philosophy. Now, we first encounter Kabbalistic writing and Kabbalistic circles in late 12th century southern France. Though the origins of its first important book, the Bahir, are probably much earlier, probably in the Eastern Mediterranean. During the 13th century, this new trend spread quickly and widely in rabbinic elite circles in Christian Spain, where key halakhic figures such as the Ramban, Nachmanides, not only adopted it, but made it into the innermost core of a Jewish lore. The attempt to characterize the content of this new trend is not simple. You will find it defined often as Jewish esotericism, that is, secret tradition, known only to the initiates and considered to be more profound than any other open knowledge. And you will often hear that it is Jewish mysticism. But as long as we define mysticism, which is a much contested and mystifying term, as man's attempt to transcend the enormous gap between himself and his God and to achieve some sort of unmediated contact with it, then we would have to admit that these two, both esotericism and mysticism, characterize the Kabbalah, but they are certainly not exclusive only to it in the context of the Middle Ages. And one has to think only of Maimonides, who's both a mysticist and an esotericist. Okay? And Maimonides usually thought of as the furthest thing from Kabbalah. So I'd like to emphasize here three other aspects of Kabbalistic thought which have greater relevancy to our discussion. First one is its theosophy. The other is its, well, at least so-called myth. And finally, its emphasis on theurgy. All terms that, of course, the Kabbalists never heard of and didn't think that that's what they are. Okay, so by theosophy, I'm referring to the Kabbalists' keen interest in the inner life of the deity. Although they acknowledge the philosophical view of God as an unchanging, undivided total unity, completely beyond human perception, they distinguish between this hidden, unintelligible God, which they call Ein Sof, and his revealed creative aspect. And though the hidden and the revealed are mostly conceived as one and the same, the Kabbalists are much more interested in the latter, which they imagine as a dynamic plurality of 10 basic aspects or forces of the divinity, 10 emanations, which constitute the basic structure of the entire being, not only God, but in the entire being. These Sfirot, as they are often called, are the God of the Bible, the God of prayer. Whenever they interpret whatever descriptions we find in the Bible of God, they interpret them through this structure of 10 Sfirot. So this brings me to the second characteristic, that is the Kabbalistic use of myth, or perhaps better, the extensive mythical element in their thought. Now I should stress that myth is quite a problematic analytic category in itself, but for the present context I refer here to the depiction, by myth, to the depiction of divinity and the cosmos through narrative and in embodied human terms, okay? Many times associated with a vivid, imaginative plasticity and creativity, right? A kind of a visualization rather than an abstraction of our discussions of creation. So, while previous scholarship, and especially the famous Gershom Scholem, which is the founding father of the discipline of Kabbalah research, saw the Kabbalah as a sudden outburst of myth into the heart of rational, myth-denying Judaism, current scholars mostly agree that Judaism was mythical enough even before the Kabbalah. And the latter is, to a great extent, a continuation of earlier mythical motifs, changing them thoroughly on the way, and the reformulation of them. Nonetheless, this is still not a trivial issue in the Middle Ages, where many attempts are made to hide or rationalize such motifs exactly, and I'm talking especially about the personality of God, which is, of course, not only common but self-evident in all Jewish texts, almost all Jewish texts prior to the Middle Ages. So, Kabbalah in general does exactly the opposite. The mythical is in the forefront. And what are better examples than the two main symbols used for the discussion of the Sfirot, the divine emanations, the tree of life, and especially the human form, the God of revelation as a macro-anthropos, the primordial and true man. We are only a bad reflection of that real man. So Kabbalistic myth is perhaps even more conspicuous with regard to divine sexuality. One of the key issues for Kabbalists who see the divine as containing both masculine and feminine aspects and describe the inner dynamics within the deity as familial, or even more daringly as sexual. The flowing of divine affluence to creation is the outcome of divine copulation, no less. Last, we come to the concept of theurgy, perhaps the most critical to the issue at hand. Kabbalists see man as having the ability to affect God. Human action, or more precisely Jewish action, can increase the divine power, but it can also decrease it. At the background of this view lies to a great extent, though far from exclusively, the question of the rationale of the commandments, Ta'amei HaMitzvot, a very central question for Jews in the Middle Ages and also before. Kabbalists believe that the commandments have an essential theurgic nature, crucial for the harmonious conduct of the divine. The deity or its emanations are thus conceived as a delicate balance of powers, dependent upon human action. When Israel sins, the balance is broken and affluence may cease. But when they act according to the divine will, they can bring the upper male and the female together. So theurgy is often conceived in sexual terms of arousement, and enable them to populate and thus to produce divine affluence for the lower realms. This human ability is due to a man both containing a divine particle within it, his soul of course, but also to the analogous structure of man and God, right? The idea of the microcosm, the kabbalistic understanding of the famous creation in God's image. Okay, so the prime literary creation of the early Kabbalah is the book of the Zohar, the book of splendor. An amazing literary accomplishment of religious imagination, supposedly written by 2nd century sages led by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, though actually written or at least compiled by circles of Kabbalists operating in late 13th century Christian Spain, and of course composed as a pseudo-epigraphy, right? Pertaining to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. The canonization of this book, the fact that it was acknowledged by many not only as authentic, but also regarded as one of the 3 most sacred corpi in Judaism, alongside with the Bible and the Talmud, sometimes even conceived as the true heart of Jewish tradition, determined to a great extent the development of later Kabbalah. Indeed, late Kabbalah, and especially 16th century Safedian Kabbalists, saw the Zohar as their primal model in all senses, and above all in their continuous striving to embody in their lives and in their religious activity the lifestyles and the ideals of the heroes of the Zoharic fellowship. That is, to live according to the model and the standard set by Rabbi Shimon and his students. That meant, above all, a feeling of extreme responsibility for the poor state of the exiled and suffering Shekhinah, right? The female aspect of the divinity accompanying Israel since the destruction of the temple. And the poor state of the Jews in the world, and the world at large, right? As everyone then and now can see. Which of course results from the destruction of the temple and the sins of Israel ever since. Now, this sense of responsibility entailed a strong feeling of guilt. After all, based on the anthropological assumptions of Kabbalistic theurgy, the bad state the world and the divinity are in are the direct result of human inactivity, or worse, harmful activity. And if only men would purify themselves and engage in pietistic and often ascetic activity, they could change their own and their God's fate. This view, both pessimistic and optimistic in its nature, was brought with Lurianic Kabbalah to its most elaborate, original, and daring extreme. In both senses, the notion of the divine crisis on the one hand, and the demand for extreme religious activism on the other. But first I want to say a few words about Isaac Luria himself. Rabbi Isaac Luria was born in 1534 in Jerusalem, then already under the prosperity of the newly arrived Ottoman rule, to a family of mixed Ashkenazi and Sephardic descent, okay, which was quite common at those times, and also later in Palestine. As a young boy, his father died, and he moved with his mother to his rich uncle, everyone needs a rich uncle, in Egypt, where he spent most of his life. In his early years, he stood out as a halachic student, but also as a merchant. The funny fact is that the only 2 documents that we have in Isaac Luria's own handwriting are letters devoted to the trade of cucumbers. Okay, so everyone has their other side. But after his wonderful career as a halachist and a merchant in the beginning, he then decided to devote himself to kabbalistic learning and spent quite a few years in solitude on an island in the middle of the Nile, studying ecstatically the Zohar. Luria, the kabbalist whose name is most synonymous today with Tzfat, actually spent in the small Galilee town only less than 2 years before dying in one of the very frequent plagues in the city. Now, although he himself was a reclusive kind of figure, right, 2 years, so many years in the middle of an island on the Nile, teaching only a handful of students, his charisma was such that he enjoyed very soon enormous authority among Safed's vibrant and creative kabbalistic community, which to begin with attracted some of the most renowned figures of the era, and of course Al-Sheikh, El-Kabetz, Karo, all really gigantic figures of Jewish both law and mysticism. So great was the imprint he left on the enthusiastic Kabbalistic world that he was soon portrayed as a saint, and his was one of the first Jewish hagiographies written in the early modern era. However, like many other innovative religious figures, one might think of the Buddha, of Zarathustra, of Rabbi Nachman, and many others, Luria wrote almost nothing himself. His teachings, without a doubt some of the most elaborate and intricate Kabbalistic writings ever to be composed, were all written, formulated, edited, rewritten by his students, who give us quite different version of his thought. And especially by his chosen and beloved student, Rabbi Hayyim Vital, who devoted his life to a tedious work of editing and re-editing again his teacher's teachings, and left us volumes and volumes of Lurianic Kabbalah, in which his special style, his interests, his temper and tendencies are quite greatly felt. Now, when we turn to the Lurianic theogony and cosmology, that is, to the Lurianic descriptions of the beginnings and current state of the creation, at the heart of today's talk, we encounter, in the words of one of its current scholars, and I quote, a seemingly endless series of inordinately complex notions presented in often fragmentary and conflicting versions. Yet, this thick web of motifs, ideas, and infinite details serves as the key to the Lurianic astounding description of the complex interrelations between man and God. A great part of the Lurianic texts are devoted to Luria's theogonic myth, that is, to the story of the birth of the Godhead and the different dramatic turns in the divine life. The extraordinary nature of this story, describing, as we shall see in a moment, God's self-contraction or self-limitation, God's self-creation and its internal crisis, leading to its catastrophic break, and finally to God's rebirth, and all of this in highly anthropomorphic terms, using anatomy and terms of the human body in very extreme manner, unequivalented by anything prior to it in Kabbalah. So all of this brought earlier scholars, and first and foremost, of course, Sholem himself, to view these myths as the heart of the Lurianic interest. But recent scholarship shows that for Luria and his disciples, the theosophical materia was merely an introduction, or a set of introductions, to the true heart of Luria's own interest, which is the human role in mending God's broken, exiled state, and the personal myth regarding Luria and Vital's own critical, messianic, of course, role. Okay. So now we should find out in some more detail what was this divine catastrophe, or at least so-called catastrophe, hanging over our heads from the beginning of my lecture. And of course, what I'm doing here is really schematically drawing a schematic portrait of something, as I said, with endless details. So if there are any Lurianic experts in the crowd, I ask your forgiveness for the injustice I do with this story. And the story begins with the Lurianic concept of tzimtzum, the divinity's withdrawal from itself into itself. And now I want to quote Vital himself. know that before the emanations were emanated and the creatures created, the simple supernal light filled all there was. And there was no empty area whatever. All this was filled with the simple infinite light. It had no beginning and no end. All was simple light in total sameness. This is called the endless light. By the way, the repetitions are one of the trademarks of Vital, so, right, don't be scared. When, in his simple will, it was resolved to create worlds and emanate the emanations, then he contracted himself within the middle point in himself, in the very center. And he contracted the light, and it was withdrawn to the sides around the middle point. There was now available an area in which there could be the emanations, the beings created, formed and made. So the problem that we are presented here, in principle, is a philosophical or pseudo-philosophical problem stemming from the notion of the all-encompassing, perfect and unitary Aristotelian God. If he is indeed such, where could the worlds be? Okay? To put it in a more of a philosophical air, how can the finite be in the infinite? Now this is a question which has a naturalistic tone to it, but it was often understood, especially later, as a question of will. To allow for wills other than his own, God had to limit, withdraw, contract, right, in the more naturalistic aspect of it, his own will. Now the mythical solution to this problem in Lurianic Kabbalah is the tzimtzum, the great contraction of God. If you will, a concession over an aspect of his fullness. God creates, and I quote again, a free space, an empty vacuum, at least seemingly, in its own center, in which the future worlds could be erected. Sholem, who saw Lurianic Kabbalah as a psychological response to the expulsion of Jews from Spain, described, by the way, an explanation which is problematic from all kinds of angles. But nevertheless, he described this process as God exiling himself, right? Like the exile from Spain, God is also exiling himself. And as I said, though this metaphor doesn't appear in the actual Lurianic text, it is nonetheless a powerful metaphor. The worlds now aren't simply emanating out of God, as we see in prior Kabbalah, but he himself has had to live them, in a sense, before. Now, we're now faced with an empty space, but of course it is not there to remain empty. And the divine worlds begin to emerge within this space, which is called Tehiru. God has left only to come back, changed, so to speak, changed, right? It's not the infinite God anymore, but now the created, limited God will reappear. Divine light now enters the Tehiru from the outside and begins forming the primordial shape, the most initial of shapes, but it is already a shape, a form, a limitation of divine light, and it is formed in an anthropomorphic shape, of course, the basis form of a man known as Adam Kadmon, right? For all the Hebrew speakers, Adam Kadmon is the Neanderthal man, right? But it comes from Lurianic Kabbalah, and even prior to that, and it's the primordial man, and in the sense of the first form of a human being. But already the first light is a human light. Okay, and I advise you from now on to try to visualize, okay, because this is highly visual. Okay. The next phase in the creation of the worlds is so drastically and wonderfully imaginative that I would advise you, in addition to visualizing, to sit tightly as you imagine the top divine world, the world of Akudim, created from a streak of divine light flowing from Adam Kadmon's ears, mouth and nostrils. And the next divine world in the hierarchy, which is the Lurianic world of Sfirot, the Zoharic Sfirot, is created from light coming out of Adam Kadmon's eyes. Okay? So if you have in your mind a kind of a Japanese animation film, works. But here comes the long-awaited moment of catastrophe. While the divine light was flowing into its vessels, the Sfirot, a malfunction occurred. And here I want to quote Vital again. To fashion pottery, the potter must first take an unformed mass of clay and then put his hand inside the mass to shape it. So the supernal emanator put its hands into the amorphous mass that is a ray of light returned from above. As this light began to enter the mass, vessels were formed from the purest light, Keter, then Binah, all names of the divine Sphirot, and so on through all 10 Sphirot. Since Keter was the purest and clearest of all the vessels, it could bear the light within it. But Chokhmah and Binah, though more translucent than those below, weren't like Keter. Not having its capacity, their backs broke, and they fell from their position. As the light descended further, 6 points appeared, 6 fragments of what had been 1 point of light. Thus, the vessels shattered. Their spiritual essence, the light, ascended back to the mother's womb, while the shattered vessels fell to the world of creation. I think that nothing can blur the outrageousness of what we have just been told by Vital. The divine vessels, which are after all God itself, could not stand the light flowing into them and simply broke. As if to make the drama even more daring, the breaking of the vessels is not only described as their shattering, but also as their death, no less. These 7 died, says Vital. The light within them, that is, the divine vitality, departed above. Now what could be the meaning of this death of God, or death within God? Never is the idea of the omnipotent God so challenged. The first question that comes to mind is, how did it occur? What went wrong, right? And indeed we find many mechanistic explanations in Lurianic Kabbalah. However, a much more pressing question is, how could it happen? Is this truly a catastrophe in the process of emanation, or is it part of the divine plan itself? And if so, why should God break itself? Shatter its own body, so to speak? Lurianic Kabbalah doesn't provide one simple answer. If we see it as an unintended malfunction, then we are facing a very, very fragile God, which is, by the way, an option that prior scholarship really rejected, but I think poses some very, very interesting intellectual horizons, right? Thinking about a fragile God, like a fragile system. Think about Jonas and ecology, right? We're talking all the time about our fragile system, but I'm putting that aside. However, and that was the option adopted by most readers of Lurianic Kabbalah, right? Not only scholars, but also kabbalistic readers. Lurianic Kabbalah offers another option, known because a wonderful scholar named Isaiah Tishby called it that, the cathartic doctrine, according to which the breaking was part of God's process of self-purification from the seeds of evil, contaminating him, so to speak. According to this idea, even the initial self-contraction was actually a reaction within infinity to the most initial effects of these almost latent seeds, which, and that's the metaphor that they use, like a grain of dirt in the middle of the ocean, of a clean ocean, caused interference, some kind of an inconvenience within the infinite God, and consequently its withdrawal. Now, without going into some of the fascinating implications of such a view, it is clear, I think, that God's autonomy is greatly challenged. Right? He too, like us all, is given to all kinds of forces constraining him. Right? The reaction within him. That's not a normal power of the will. Right? So his total will and total control are not as total as we are all customarily used to think. However, this catastrophe, whether purposeful or not, is of course not the end of the story of theogony. Immediately after the breaking of the vessel starts the process of tikkun, repair or mending. The divinity begins rebuilding itself, mending its structures, reforming its lights in a stronger, more stable manner. A process described often in Lurianic Kabbalah as the rebirth of the broken parts of God. The shattered vessels are brought back into the divine womb and come out after a long and complex embryologic, right? It's really descriptions of the divine baby starting to form, embryologic process in the renewed, sustainable structure. So up to this point, all the processes we encountered were intra-divine, right? God may have suffered a great crisis, but He has also recuperated and mended itself, right? So where is man? In what way is he responsible for God? The answer lies in the fact that according to Luria and Vital, the final and critical stage of God's restitution was not yet done, and could not be completed without the creation of man, or to be exact, of Adam Harishon, the first Adam. While in many myths regarding Adam, he himself is responsible for bringing corruption or damage to the world, here we have an interesting twist to the tale, as Adam was created in order to repair, or to be exact, to complete the repair of the damage. And the completion of the mending was to be carried out throughout the Sabbath, and to be done through theurgical prayer, right? Through man's actions and their mystical influence on the deity. But, as you all know, Adam did not perform his duty correctly and sinned. It is very telling, by the way, that the leading explanation of his sin is that he was too eager to perform his duty. Okay, not anxious for sexual pleasure or sinful in a general manner, but too eager to perform his duty, and thus did not perform it accurately enough. So the problem is a problem of accuracy, already suggesting how punctual Lurianic Kabbalists are demanded to be. To make clear just how immensely crucial is human action in Lurianic eyes, Adam's sin is considered and described as a reenactment of the breaking of the vessels, no less. This has to do in part with the depiction of Adam as a macroanthropos, meaning a cosmic entity composed of all the human souls to come, quite different from the usual human being. But it mainly means that many of the restored divine vessels and lights are yet again fallen. And now, the descendants of Adam, all of us sitting here in the room, are responsible not only to clean his mess, but also to perform his initial duty and restore all the divine lights to their correct place, thus bringing, of course, harmony back to the Godhead and to the entire creation. As one scholar put it, in Luria's eyes, the most fundamental and ultimate goal of all human existence is tikkun, restitution. The project of tikkun required the most elaborate and painstaking regime of contemplative devotion. One that we may call radical theurgy in a double sense, perhaps even a triple sense. First of all, in the pretentious nature of the assumption that this strict regimen is enough in order to accomplish the minor goal, right, so to speak, of completing the restitution of the deity and repairing its defects, a process equivalent, of course, to bringing salvation or geulah to the entire world, right? Second, in the rich ritualistic content of this regimen, showing true innovation and creativity, and more importantly perhaps, demanding full and total commitment of all the disciples. And I've mentioned the third aspect, I think, which is very important, with the pretension to be able to gain all that knowledge, to get the kind of an engineering plan of the deity, right? The accurate model of the deity that will enable you to work on it correctly, right? To perform your deeds correctly, which is not a small thing. Okay. Lurianic Kabbalists, right, from the 16th century onwards, even until now, people still practice Lurianic regimens of actions up to this day. So, Lurianic Kabbalists weren't only demanded to add special theurgical prayers and kavanot, special mystical intentions, which are all very, very technical in nature, to the performance of the commandments. They were also following the notion that every act they perform, and I mean every act they perform, in every realm of life, starting from eating to feeling to sleeping, everything is meaningful and bears consequences on the fate of God. Every single action. This entailed an almost obsessive preoccupation with sin and with self-purification, and also with Luria's diagnostical abilities, right? Enabling him to tell the disciples what they still needed to do in order to live a saintly life, and so to advance the process of restitution and salvation. Now imagine the feeling of these 16th century Galilean Kabbalists, feeling the entire fate of the world, of God, and of their exiled people lying on their own shoulders, or perhaps not only on their shoulders, but in their entire body and soul. No wonder Lurianic Kabbalah contains such a vast mapping with infinite details of the divinity and of humanity. It is a knowledge critical if you want to act efficiently. Okay, that's a very modern way of thinking. With the precision of a brain surgeon. And I'm not saying brain surgeon coincidentally, because both Vital and probably also Luria were doctors. Not performing perhaps surgery, but medical doctors of their time. Okay, so performing this very, very delicate kind of a surgery or medical treatment on a God that needs them, right? On a God that needs you. It is also no wonder that this was actually perceived not as a work cut out for the many, but as an esoteric knowledge to be performed by the elect few. Oh. So coming to an end, the Lurianic Kabbalah may well be understood when it emphasizes so strongly the dependence of God on the humans He created, to be actually articulating the human need for responsibility and agency in the face of a corrupt, malfunctioning world, to a great deal at the expense of the traditional attribution of such responsibility and agency to God Himself. In this sense, Lurianic Kabbalah has an optimistic aspect to it, right? Because it is possible for us to act in this malfunctioning world. But at the same time, this doctrine offers the believer a great deal of guilt and anxiety, very well felt in the writings just as well. So much can still be said about the meaning of this change of equilibrium between God's agency and man's, right? And about its quite modern nature. And part of the challenge is, of course, situating this in much wider processes that Western and Middle Eastern world is undergoing at that time exactly. But perhaps to close this talk, maybe we should point the question to Luria's successors, right? Hans Jonas, Eti Hilsum are already unable to continue this legacy, but also all the people in the room, of course, which is how, if this metaphor is so modern, about the ability to work mechanically sometimes, technically sometimes, in a world which is so complicated but is so malfunctioning, so in what way can we take on and continue this radical idea by Isaac Luria? Thank you.
Assaf, is it possible to take questions now?
Yeah, of course.
Could you say something about the possible link between Cordovero and Luria?
Well, Cordovero, when we talk about Tzfat, we're usually talking about two great kabbalists, Cordovero and Luria, okay? By Moses Cordovero de Lomac. In essence, okay, it's a complex question, because the easy answer is, of course, that Cordovero was Luria's teacher. The question if they met or not is not so important. Probably they met once or twice, Luria probably gave a eulogy in Cordovero's funeral, but the question is not so important because Luria was nurtured by Cordoverian writings for sure, and more importantly than that, Vital, the student of Luria, was before that a student of Cordovero, and you can feel all the time the imprint of Cordoverian Kabbalah on his reworkings of his teacher's Luria writings. So the effect is immense. On the other hand, one of the great riddles of Safedian Kabbalah is, of course, what's the relation between these two Kabbalahs? Because they're also very different in temperament, in terminology, in emphasis. And this is, I think, a question that still needs to be answered. Part of it is connected to the freedom that Lurianic Kabbalah has, unlike Luria, especially in some of his writings. Some of his writings are quite wild, but some of his more renowned writings are very, very committed to taking different sorts of knowledge and compromising them and trying to make order in them, because one of the characteristics of Tzfat in the 16th century is that it brought together exiles from all over, right? Traditions from Spain primarily, but the Balkans and North Africa and Musta'arabin, which are Arab Jews, the original Arab Jews, right? Jews living in Arabic language vicinity and so on. So a lot of new information, a lot of different traditions were accumulated in one place, and Cordovero's project, in a sense, was trying to make order, trying to make sense of the different traditions and to see how they work together. Luria was much less interested in that. Yeah.
Was it Elephantine he was living on as an island or in the Nile?
Actually I don't know. I have no... the stories that we have don't name the island, okay? So it would be interesting to try to reanimate his Egyptian history in a more serious manner. I think it still awaits a scholar to do that. And so I really don't know. Yeah.
What's the relationship between modern orthodoxy and Kabbalah?
No modern orthodoxy exists which is not kabbalistic. Now you may get different answers than mine from other people, but I will insist. Hasidism is, of course, Lurianic traditions are the basis of Hasidism, although they were changed immensely while reformulated there. But the same goes for Lithuanian Orthodoxy, in the sense that the Gaon of Vilna, okay, the founder of Lithuanian tradition, the forefather, if you want, if you will, was a great Kabbalist and a great interpreter, by the way, of Lurianic Kabbalah. So in that sense too, and of course, Rabbi Kook, if you want to go to religious Zionism, no doubt he was a Kabbalist. The question should be not if Kabbalah has or hasn't a presence. The question should be how aware are people to its presence, because a lot of people use a lot of Kabbalah without being aware of that. I don't know how important that is, but that's the fact. That's one. And another question would, of course, be what would be the objections to Kabbalah in a lot of circles, and you will find that too. But the basic fact that Kabbalah has a presence, okay, sometimes more felt and sometimes less, right? Sometimes it's dominant and people define themselves according to their Kabbalistic heritage and try to understand themselves all the time through their Kabbalistic heritage, and sometimes not. By the way, I did a horrible sin, and I mentioned Lithuanians, Hasidim, and religious Zionism, and I didn't mention the Mizrahi, and the whole tradition of Arab Jews and their religiosity, which is of course filled with Kabbalah. It's very central there without a problem, so I apologize to the entire Eastern Jewry. Yes?
Do you consider Kabbalah as a creation of Tzfat and Spain and France in the Middle Ages, or is there continuity from the prophets and Hezekiel through the rabbinic times? Do you find early Kabbalah?
Like the famous joke, yes, right? Right, the rabbi the couple that quarrel, and the rabbi says, you're both right, okay? It's a new creation, of course, because it's a reformulation not only in the time of in Middle Ages time, right? Not only in the 13th century, but it is reformulated time after time, okay? And changes all the time. So in that sense, of course, it's a new creation, but it's a new creation that continues a lot of different trends while changing them, okay? And especially, what's the name Kabbalah? Kabbalah means receiving or transmission, right? Its basic assumption, in its own views, is of continuation. So we may be cynical and say that they're calling themselves Kabbalah, transmission, right? In order to dispute the claims that they brought something new into Judaism, right? Most scholars would claim that, especially early scholars. But I think that it's not cynical at all. They really perceive themselves as those reanimating, re-understanding the real traditions of Judaism. Okay?
But are there any sort of known sources you could point to?
Midrash. So much of the Kabbalah is grounded in Midrash. Normal, regular, simple Midrash. Yeah? Yes, I'm just...
What exactly is the historical context of Luria's writing? What happened during his time that made him feel that you need to explain God's weakness, for example? Is it the expelled from Spain? Or?
Okay, so that's of course the million-dollar question, but the hardest historical question, because now we're in the world of speculation. I can say that expulsion the expulsion from Spain, but not only from Spain. We always talk only about the expulsion from Spain. That other Jews were expelled at the same time as well, and of course this is a long tradition of expulsions. But of course that's in the background, but not only because of the trauma, as it was once presented, but also because entire communities are in movement. When entire communities are in movement, intellectual life is reanimated always, is alive always. But you also have another very important thing, which is and underestimated historically for sure, and that's the fact that there's a new empire, the Ottoman Empire. And this new empire, right, 1519, exactly at the time of the Renaissance of Tzfat, like 10 years before Tzfat is conquered by the Ottomans. And this new Ottoman Empire brings new cultural opportunities, new breadth, because the prior empire was very restrictive, new prosperity, but also the option of going to Palestine, okay? So you have a lot of Jews suddenly able to be in Palestine, not generally in Palestine, in Eretz Israel, but specifically in Tzfat, where Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is supposed to be buried, okay? They can go and be close to him. And that was something that was felt as a messianic, pointer, so to speak. Messianic opportunity, maybe that's the better word. But I would say that a lot of other things, Reformation and Contra-Reformation, critical to understand this, so many of what happens here, right? Think about the obsession with sin, right? The look inwards, the changes in subjectivity, more discipline, all are critical aspects to understanding what happens in Europe at the same time, in Italy and in other places, and so on and so forth. So we have a new science. That's part of my PhD. I try to read Lurianic Kabbalah in the light of different scientific discourses that are at the time, and they're changing it completely. Just think of the view of the doctor, right, of the medical doctor on a patient. Quite similar to the way the kabbalist looks at his God, okay? But that, of course, demands much more elaboration. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a wonderful book by Fine.
Yeah.
Fine book, yeah.
A fine book indeed.
Really is. One of the most illuminating points he makes, I think, is in Safed at the time, the kabbalists and the Sufis were actually practicing together the path of self-purification.
Yeah.
And you could argue that Neoplatonic influences in both.
Mm-hmm.
Has anyone written how they understood each other?
Well, yeah, I would say that fine book, and I totally agree that it's a fine book, is not entirely responsible in regard to this fact, historically speaking. It draws the connections too easily. We have a few wonderful papers written by Paul Fenton, who is a scholar of Jewish and Muslim Sufism at the time, who writes about possible connections between different rituals and practices by Sufis and by Safavians. And the analogies are very interesting, but we still don't really have the connection historically. I say here very parenthetically, or very, I would say, cautiously, that we do have in Vital's diary, and one of the amazing things is that we have Vital's diary, luckily enough. It's a weird diary, but a very interesting one. One of the first ego documents to be written by Jews in early modernity, right? And there he records a few meetings that he has with local Muslims. He calls them palilim, a word which is not very easily understood. I suspect that they are popular doctors, okay? But popular Muslim doctors are a lot of times also popular religious persons, okay? Probably Sufis. Sufis were all around there. So maybe there we have some hints still unexplored about real connections. And indeed, as much as I mentioned European processes that are important, no doubt, and that still needs much scholarship, because as always, you know, everyone turns to the West instead of turning to the East, and Europe is overstudied while Ottoman culture is understudied. We have much less scholarship on that, but it's a very promising path indeed.
If I could just add one more point, Damascus is, I looked it up, 71 miles away.
Oh, of course, Vital lived in Damascus most of his life. Strictly speaking, when you want to understand where people are living, they're not living in Palestine or Eretz Israel, because there is no such thing, okay? There are no borders. Sykes-Picot hasn't come to the world, okay? The borders are open. My family comes from Tzfat, and I always remember the stories about my great-grandfather riding his horse from Tzfat to Damascus. He was a doctor, right? So the same goes for them. This is one place. One place. And Cairo too, by the way. The relations between Egypt and Palestine were also great, and you can't understand nothing without them. So, yeah.
Could you consider some of those first century Hasidim, like Rabbi Hayyim Vital, like some kind of kabbalist, or is there no connection at all?
There is a connection only in the sense that models of piety were important later. Okay, there's a connection in the sense that they are carriers of rabbinic traditions, and those were adopted by kabbalists. So I wouldn't go to Hanina ben Dosa or Chonia Me'ager or all those people in order to find like a secret esoteric sect that ran along Judaism secretly until it bursted out only within Kabbalah. Maybe we can find that in Heichalot literature. I highly doubt that too. I think the traditions re-emerged in all sorts of ways in the Middle Ages from an early stage, not 12th century but earlier, but still we have a lot of vagueness because we don't have texts, we have hints, that's all, right? So I wouldn't imagine like a line of father telling son from Hanina ben Dosa to Moshe de Leon. I don't think so, but I do think that these people, these types, were essential in creating later types. But probably Rabbi Akiva is much more important than Hanina ben Dosa, okay? As the type of someone who is in the Pardes, right? However you interpret this Pardes, right? But also is part of the community and is a normative character, okay? Nachmanides, right? He's not the Rabbi Hanina. He's the pillar stone of the community.
But you have the Hasidim Rishonim. But you have this group that called Hasidim Rishonim that appears in the Talmud that they describe, if I don't make a mistake, as a group of people that take upon themselves more than others, and it has to do, like, for example, they took more time before the tefillah, before services, just to take their, and I think this is practices that we can see later on in the kabbalistic.
Oh, of course. I mean, that's exactly what I meant by models that are later adopted. When they look for precedents for their own interests and their own wishes, they have where to look at, okay? Think about Ashkenazi Hasidim, right? Most probably modeling themselves on these models more so, and then affecting. So historically, there's a few places to look in the middle, but they read this text, no doubt. Yes, I think, yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture.
Thank you.
When you talked about the myth of creation, if I may.
The what?
The myth of creation, the kabbalistic myth of creation, if that's the correct name. You said that so when God withdrew from and into himself in the beginning, you said that this was a question of his will, and so that he willed to exile himself. But you also mentioned what I heard more as a philosophical question. So how can there be finite beings in the infinite? So how should one understand this will? I mean, why did he withdraw as a response to a logical impossibility, or was this more like a gesture of love or generosity because he wanted there to be finite beings?
Okay, so the answer in a couple of levels. First of all the concepts you mentioned are philosophical concepts. I mean, will is just as much a philosophical concept as finitude and infinitude, in that sense, in their discourse. But moreover, I think that if there is a meaning to calling Lurianic Kabbalah a myth, okay, a category that I don't know if you managed to hear between the lines, I'm not very keen on. It creates more problems for understanding than solutions. But put that aside, if there is any logic to calling it myth, it is exactly in that it is easily interpretable in a lot of ways. For example, the question of will, right, was a major way for later readers of Lurianic Kabbalah to overcome the over-naturalistic manner of this tzimtzum, this contraction. It sounds too naturalistic, right? So you have to reinterpret it in philosophical terms, right? For example, Ramchal, the famous Lutzato, right, the 18th century kabbalist, who devoted an entire book to salvaging Lurianic Kabbalah from itself through a rereading of it. And will, the question of will, is for him the main ladder of escape from this mythical way of thinking. Okay, but nonetheless, I think it's a good question in the sense that how can and a question a lot of people try to answer. I don't think there is, by the way, an answer. It's a paradoxical problem, right? The question of the finite and the infinite. Everyone, since the Greeks up to now, is trying, and they're moving the breaking point from here to there and from there to here. But you know, the question remains. I think the most interesting one was Spinoza in his reading, because he said that, well, two systems. That's how I understand it. But that's I go beyond my scope because I don't really know anything about Spinoza. Yes.
What do you think the Kabbalah tradition or the Kabbalistic way to see the world? What could it attribute to the word, to this modern culture of self? This how do you say it?
Realization, self-realization.
Yes, because it's a question about dependence and coexistence. In what way could Kabbalah be useful for us and for the future?
So I'll start by answering empirically, in the sense that a lot of very modern people who are absorbed in the self and in the religion of the self, in context, for example, of New Age, find in Kabbalah, and Lurianic Kabbalah specifically, sources for their understanding. So empirically speaking, in the world, they do it without any difficulty. Okay, but now you ask, but on the other hand, you can see a lot of interpretations of it, which go to entirely different paths. Okay? I would say that one of the secrets for me of the success of Kabbalah, and Lurianic Kabbalah specifically, in the world, aside from its fluidity which allows it enough interpretations, but that's besides the point, that's something too general, is that it's in essence very, very modern. That's why I'm studying it partially because this is a very early modern phenomenon that bears in it some very, very modern elements. One of them is the obsession with subjectivity. A lot of times defined very, very differently than our own subjectivity, right? There's two parts of subjectivity, very, very schematically drawn, that we're talking about. One is what we may call the Taylorian, because Taylor was a wonderful historian that discussed it a lot, which is, the Enlightenment kind of subjectivity. We are autonomous, we are ourselves, the resources for ourselves is in ourselves, and we control our own fate, right, and empower ourselves, and so on and so forth. But we have another line of thinking about the self which is just as modern, which is the line of thinking about ourselves as components in a great world which determines us all the time, right? That by great systems, if you want, discourses, if you want, the school and the thought and our parents and everything, which determines us all the time, and in which we hardly are able to think about free will in a serious manner. Philosophically, free will is something very hard to talk about. Even today, by the way, I'm not. I have no idea if scientifically this is something interesting or not, but it's culturally very interesting. But they have all kinds. It's very fashionable now in biological circles, right? When you hear like an introduction to biology, they will tell you that we have research now showing that free will, empirical evidence that free will is non-existent. Okay, so really, I don't have much to say about it scientifically, but I do think that if culturally people are thinking about themselves because of science and because of the way we live in that way, right, it means something, that we have another kind of self that we work with. And Lurianic Kabbalah, Kabbalah in general, opens the path to thinking in both dimensions, very seriously, because the responsibility is on you and you have to fix God and everything, and right, all this man has such a tremendous importance. And yet, he's also just one small screw in a horrendous, if you want, or wonderful machine. Depends on your point of view.
It's a way of defining relationship, that's it.
Well, that's one way of looking at it, yes.
Yeah. There's an interesting author called Rabbi Kaplan who has written two books. One is called Meditation and Kabbalah. And then he has another volume which speaks about an earlier tradition called the Sefer Yetzirah. And in the Sefer Yetzirah they are connecting the otiot with different parts of the body. Is that seen as a predating of the Tarsufim discourse in the Lurianic Kabbalah?
Well, Sefer Yetzirah, which is a very, very intriguing but enigmatic book, composed who knows when, no one knows when. The views vary from the 1st century to the 9th century, sort of, right? So really no one knows. And Sefer Yetzirah, this enigmatic little treatise, is probably the basis for a lot of the philosophical thought of Jews in the Middle Ages, but also for the kabbalistic thought. And of course, the very complex theory of language that it offers stands as an important source of influence for a lot of the writings later on. Not all of them take the specific theory of language of Sefer Yetzirah as such. They change it thoroughly, but all of them cling to it in order to understand themselves. And of course you can find Sefer Yetzirah also in Lurianic Kabbalah, although not as much as you would expect. There are other kabbalistic streams which use Sefer Yetzirah much, much, much more extensively, but of course it's there. But the connection, this basic connection between letters, right? The world is created by words of God, right? So this basic connection between letters and the divine body and the human body is quite bluntly made in Lurianic Kabbalah, and as much as they are conceptualized, the divine entities, as much as they are conceptualized in body terms, they're also conceptualized through the theology of letters, and this combination, by the way, makes for a very, very interesting concept.
Is that the relationship between the human body and the body of Adam Kadmon, or is it perhaps
also, yeah,
on some other level also?
I'll give you a very, very small example. When Luria wants to diagnose a sinner, right, what he sees, he checks his pulse, right, and he feels letters. He feels letters. Or he sees letters on his forehead. You can see letters. Why? Because if you know to see correctly, and most of us don't, right, then you can see all the world composed of letters. It's just a matter. If you could see correctly, you could see this table, and you can see this, its letter, right, like to see it atom.
This
it's
is like
atoms.
Abulafia.
Oh, Abulafia is part of that, of course. Of course. Okay, another question?
Yes.
You tell me when to stop.
Maybe that will be the last question. Okay.
So, did Lurianic Kabbalah have an influence on the discourse on free will in the 17th century in Europe in general? On the discourse on free will in Christian Europe in the 17th century, or not really?
A wonderful question. I mean, I can guess, then I would say yes, because that's what I would like to assume, but I don't know. I don't know enough. I can say that, more generally speaking, it had quite an influence on some of the heroes of the scientific revolution. Okay? And because those people were very fascinated by the question of free will, then the answer would be kind of yes. Right? But Newton was a Kabbalist, Leibniz was a Kabbalist, a Christian Kabbalist, of course, and a lot of other heroes of that time. So, and Kabbalah was very much in fashion. So, in a sense, yes. Thank you.
So, thank you very much for this very interesting lecture, and I think that all of us enjoyed it. And here's what we will give from Paideia.
Thank you very much.
Toda Rabbi.